Unforgettable ride. Sometimes I started in Norfolk, Virginia, sometimes in Memphis, Tennessee, but all I ever needed were white crosses and coffee to get from sea to shining sea. For years I drove 18-wheelers coast to coast. I was one of those guys they gave the load to when it was already late and had to be there yesterday. It's a game to me, a sport, if you will, played in 80,000-pound toys rolling way over the legal speed limit. The game was to get there on time, and we always played with the clock against us. That was part of it. I liked a challenge. There were a lot of other pitfalls along the way, too, such as weather, scales to be avoided, bears to give you a speeding ticket, or worse, a check of your logbook that would put you out of service for driving too many hours. It wasn't just from coast to coast. It was coast to coast to coast. That meant from the Atlantic to the Pacific and back in 1 week. 6 or 7 days if you couldn't reload fast enough. Getting reloaded was the least of my problems. There was always plenty of freight going from one side of the country to the other. The big problem I had, that all drivers had, was staying awake. Sure, you could doze at the wheel. After all, you were driving a 25-foot wide ribbon of concrete. Any jockey could do that. It was remembering where to turn off to get round the scales. It was remembering which of your several log books you were using at any particular time. It was keeping those manifestos and fuel loading slips in proper order. It was making sure you kept one ear cocked to the CB so you could keep up with what was going on 20, 50, or 100 miles ahead and plan your trip from the Rand McNally in your lap while you were eating a sandwich, all at 85+ miles per hour. So, what did we use to keep us conscious, if not totally awake? Well, some truckers use other things. Most of them use caffeine products. The main reason is that federal trucking regulations now require random mandatory drug testing. This could take place at your home terminal, at any scale house, or on a whim as a call from your friendly dispatcher. Nothing forbids the ingestion of caffeine in amount sufficient to wire an elephant to the point he could walk a tightrope. So that is what I did. Each day, each week, every trip, coast to coast to coast, in 1 week. The trip really started for me when I first stopped for fuel. There, at the fuel island, I would fill my thermos with coffee, straight from the pot, black, uncut with cream or sweetener. Sugar would give me a quick rush, but make me crash just as fast, and I sure didn't want that. Creamer would just dilute the effects of caffeine, so I did not use it. Somewhere close to the fuel desk would be the pills. There were always at least half a dozen brands of caffeine pills, various strengths, and I would buy a pocketful of those. If I was lucky, the C-store would carry Joke Cola, a personal favorite of mine, though hard to get in many places. Together with a few sandwiches, I was ready to roll, and 3 days later I was on the opposite coast. One can imagine the effects that caffeine ultimately had on my body, but we will get to that soon enough. First, let's talk about the more immediate effects it had on me. When I got my first road gig, I wanted to do well. I came from a family of truckers. My daddy, both my uncles, and most importantly, my big brother were all truckers. Truck driving was not a job, it was a lifestyle. They each had their own truck, and more than anything, I wanted one of my own. On those rare family get-togethers, it was all about where you'd been, what you hauled, and how fast you got it there. When I started driving, I already knew the cardinal sin of driving 18-wheelers was not delivering on time. Nothing else really mattered. That is the main goal of a truck driver. Do whatever it takes and no excuses. I learned early on that to successfully do that, a driver had to remain awake and alert, and one surefire legal way was through the extreme use of caffeine. This wasn't just a family secret, as all the hot jockeys used it. We were not team drivers. We were a group of single drivers, all independent owner-operators who specialized in coast-to-coast expedited freight. Being mostly a sweet tea drinker growing up, I did not drink much coffee. And while both tea and soda do have some caffeine in them, my main stimulus came from the pouch of School Bandit lodged between my lip and gum. But a glass of sweet tea and a box of School will not keep you awake for long. So when I asked around, I was told that the answer was caffeine. Primarily coffee, and lots of it. If, for some reason, coffee was not available at the moment you needed it, then tea, soda, or pills would all do the trick. Being wired is a familiar feeling for everyone. The electric tingles, the fast heart rate, and the pounding blood pressure, along with the dreaded red ear syndrome. Whatever your reason is for getting wide, whether it be just for kicks or to stay awake delivering a load, if you don't keep yourself wide, the effects are going to eventually wear off. That is when the abuse begins, because otherwise you will crash. I slowly reached the point where I no longer got a rush. I knew when I needed more, since I did not want to crash. I got to the point that I knew how many cups of coffee it would take to get me through as many hours as I wanted to stay awake. I also knew that if I needed extra time, I could take pills for that extra kick. When Starbucks went nationwide in the 1990s, I found where I could get shots of espresso to go along with my thermos of regular coffee. Finally, I got to the point where all I wanted was espresso. By that time, I could not even start my day without caffeine. Some people I knew would smoke a cigarette sitting on the side of their bed first thing every morning. Instead, I would walk inside the truck stop where I spent the night and have my first cup of coffee. That is how I started my day every day. While eating breakfast, I would wash it down with several more cups. Before I left the truck stop, I would fill my thermos with hot black coffee. Sometimes I would drink 2 thermoses of coffee a day and tea for lunch and supper. Throw in the occasional soda and a handful of pills, and you get the idea of the monkey on my back. And this big monkey was about to kick my ass. The end came one winter morning in New Mexico. I was heading west and, as usual, running hard. I was flying low and fast with the sun coming up in my rearview mirrors and the white snow showing off the many colors of the painted desert. They say a man can go to sleep with his eyes open, and I agree. My body just quit responding to the caffeine and simply shut down to save itself. Fortunately, there was no one else close by at the time. I watched through sleep-closed, open eyes as the right front wheel of my long-nosed Peterbilt caught the soft earth on the side of the road and pulled me off I-40 and onto the desert floor. I couldn't have left the road at a better time. There was nothing to keep me on the road, no ditch, no fence, nothing to hit. I woke up doing nearly 100 miles per hour across the desert in an 18-wheeler, and folks, I am here to tell you it is a ride that I will never forget. Growing up, roller coasters were my idea of the ultimate thrill, and as I crisscrossed the continent in my truck, I stopped at every major theme park and rode their roller coasters. There is nothing, and I do mean nothing, that can even start to come close to waking up in an 18-wheeler doing 100 miles per hour across hard-packed dirt. Great caffeine spirit had not deserted me yet. As if to compensate for worshiping it so faithfully for so many years, the caffeine spirit kept my truck from turning over, slowed it down, and eventually stopped it a good quarter-mile off the highway. I waited there long enough for another driver to stop, pull over, and walk all the way to my truck to check on me. Finally, after pulling my quivering, shaking self together and assuring him that I was okay, I drove back to the highway and down the road to the next truck stop, where I went to sleep. For the first time ever, I was late for a delivery. Knowing what caused the accident and that I had been phenomenally fortunate, I immediately decided that this lifestyle was no longer for me. I booked a slow trip back home, took my time, drove legally, and thought a lot. I knew that caffeine had to go and that the next time, well, there couldn't be a next time. The odds were just too great against surviving it. I returned home before the bad part began. I knew it was coming, but I had no idea that caffeine withdrawal would be so difficult. I thought that particular problem was only associated with real drugs. I was very edgy with everybody. I stayed awake for long periods of time, unable to sleep, and then would finally pass out. At other times I would suddenly fall asleep sitting in a chair. My body didn't know what was going on and was seeking equilibrium. I had developed acid reflux. My hands and indeed my entire body shook, and my vision had become blurry. Quitting caffeine cured all those symptoms. Gradually my vision cleared. My stomach shrank back to a normal size, and the shaking went away completely. And I swear that the hair on my head started to grow back. Quitting cold turkey was not easy, but it was the only way I knew how to do it. Where I lived up in the hills of Kentucky, there were no clinics. Many of the small towns didn't have conventional doctors. There were some root doctors who brewed me herbal teas, which helped a lot. So did taking long walks through the hills. Finally, when I was ready, I went back to the only work I knew how to do, driving trucks. This time I did it differently. Rather than long hauls, I switched to heavy hauls. When you see a huge rig coming down the road, escorted by police officers who are stopping traffic and shutting down roads for the load to come by, that is me. I don't have to be anywhere fast. I just have to be there safe. I no longer need caffeine to keep me awake for hours. Now I need steady hands to guide hundreds of thousands of pounds and to keep it upright round curves. Yeah, I have a short cup of coffee sometimes on a cold morning or a glass of sweet tea on a hot summer day. That is all. I just don't like the way it tastes anymore.